No one in Tolbat County ever talked about what lay beneath the Harrove plantation. Not during the war, not after it, and certainly not in the decades when cotton profits kept the red Georgia soil stained and silent. But in March of 1865, when Union troops forced their way through the plantation-'s collapsing main house, they uncovered something that stopped even veteran soldiers in their tracks. Beneath the rotting floorboards was a concealed cellar, barely larger than a livestock stall. Its walls were covered in hundreds of shallow scratches, layered over one another as if made over months, maybe longer. In one corner hung a rusted iron chain, bolted firmly into the stone, yet attached to nothing, and pressed into the hardened mud nearby were two handprints, one clearly adult, the other so small it could only have belonged to a child. County records confirm that the Harrove family abandoned the property 3 weeks before Sherman's forces reached the area. They left behind furniture, livestock, even personal effects. After that, they vanished completely. No sightings, no graves, no descendants who would ever claim the name. What the soldiers documented in that cellar was sealed away under military classification for more than 60 years. And when the files were finally released to the public, 3 pages were missing, cleanly removed, as if someone wanted to ensure the full truth never surfaced. Tonight, we're reconstructing what may have happened during the 9 months leading up to the Harrove family's disappearance. A story rooted in survival, fear, and a secret that was never meant to see daylight. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to Vintage Truths and turn on notifications. We uncover forgotten and unsettling chapters of history, stories buried by time and silence. Drop a comment telling us where you're listening from. Now, let's step back to where this nightmare truly began. The spring of 1864 arrived in Tolbert County with the kind of oppressive heat that made the air shimmer above the cotton fields like water over hot stones. The Harrove plantation sprawled across 300 acres of Georgia red clay, a modest operation by the standards of the wealthier families in neighboring counties, but substantial enough to require 32 enslaved people to keep it running. The main house, a 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a sagging front porch, sat at the end of a long dirt road lined with magnolia trees that had stopped blooming years ago. Some said the trees had given up like everything else in Georgia that spring. Sensing the approaching end of a world built on suffering, Thomas Harrove ran his plantation with the cold efficiency of a man who viewed human beings as livestock, valuable when productive, disposable when not. He was 43 years old, with thinning hair and a face that had settled into permanent lines of suspicion and calculation. His father had built the plantation from nothing, clawing his way up from poor white farmer to slave owner through ruthless ambition and a willingness to do things that kept his neighbors at a careful distance. Thomas had inherited that ambition along with the property, but not his father's cunning. The war was bleeding the South dry, and Thomas could feel his world crumbling beneath his feet like the red clay after a hard rain. His wife, Margaret, rarely left her upstairs bedroom, her health deteriorating from what the local doctor vaguely termed nervous exhaustion. In truth, Margaret had retreated from a world she could no longer bear to witness. She spent her days staring out the window at the fields, her hands trembling, her mind somewhere far away. The servants whispered that she'd lost 3 children in infancy, that the grief had broken, something inside her that could never be repaired. Thomas visited her room once a week, standing awkwardly in the doorway, asking if she needed anything. She never answered. Their overseer, a thick-necked man named Virgil Cates, handled the daily brutalities with enthusiasm that made even Thomas uncomfortable on occasion. Virgil was 35, unmarried, with small eyes set too close together and hands that were always clenched into fists. He'd grown up poor in the Carolina backcountry, the son of a failed farmer who drunk himself to death, and he'd learned early that the only way to rise in the world was to be willing to inflict pain on those below you. He carried a leather strap on his belt and used it liberally, finding reasons where none existed. The enslaved people on the Harrove plantation feared him more than they feared Thomas, and with good reason. Among the enslaved population was a girl named Bess, 11 years old, small for her age, with quick hands and watchful eyes that had learned early to see everything and reveal nothing. Her skin was the color of polished walnut, her hair kept short and covered with a faded cloth. She moved through the world like a shadow, present but unnoticed, which was exactly how she'd survived this long. She worked in the main house, scrubbing floors, emptying chamber pots, fetching water from the well, and performing the 100 other invisible tasks that kept the Harrove household functioning. Her mother had been sold away when Bess was 6, sent to a plantation in Alabama to settle a gambling debt. Bess had screamed and clung to her mother's skirts, and Virgil had torn her away and locked her in the smokehouse for 2 days to teach her about obedience. She had no memory of her father. Ruth, the cook, said he'd been sold before Bess was born, but Ruth said a lot of things, and Bess had learned not to trust anyone completely. Bess slept. In a narrow space beneath the kitchen stairs, a crawl space barely tall enough for her to sit upright, accessible through a small door that most people assumed was just a storage closet. The space was perhaps 4 feet wide and 6 feet long, with a dirt floor and walls made of rough planks that let in drafts during winter. She had a thin blanket, a straw pallet that smelled of mildew, and a small wooden box where she kept her few possessions, a smooth river stone she'd found by the creek, a piece of blue glass from a broken bottle, and a scrap of fabric that had once been part of her mother's dress. It wasn't much, but it was hers. And in a world where she owned nothing, not even herself, that mattered, it was there, in that forgotten corner of the house, that her life intersected with a secret that would consume the next 9 months and change everything she thought she knew about survival, loyalty, and the price of doing what was right in a world built on doing wrong. The night it began, Bess woke to sounds that didn't belong. It was late April, and through the gaps in the floorboards above her head, she could hear Thomas Harrove's boots, pacing back and forth across the kitchen. His voice was low and urgent, speaking to someone she couldn't see. Bess had learned to wake at the slightest unusual sound. It was a survival skill, like knowing when to make herself invisible or when to speak. She pressed her ear against the gap between 2 floorboards, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You're certain nobody saw you bring him here?" Thomas asked. His voice carried a note of panic that Bess had never heard before. Thomas Hargrove didn't panic. He was always controlled, always calculating, dead certain. That was Virgil Cates. His voice rough and low. "Found him collapsed in the North Woods, right where the property line meets the Dorson place. Got a bullet in his shoulder. Fever burning? Gee him up something fierce. He won't last the night without help, maybe not even with it. Then let him die in the woods. Why in God's name did you bring him to my house?" Thomas's voice rose slightly, then dropped again, conscious of waking the household. There was a pause. Bess could hear the scrape of a chair being pulled across the floor, the creak of someone sitting down heavily. "'Cause he's got information," Virgil said quietly, "about the Union movement. He's a Confederate scout, been operating behind enemy lines for 3 months. Says he's got intelligence that could change everything. Troop position, supply routes, weak points in their defenses, plans for Sherman's march. But he needs time to recover, and he needs to stay hidden. The Union's got patrols combing these woods looking for him. They know he's wounded. They know he's somewhere in this area. If they find him, they'll hang him as a spy." Bess heard Thomas exhale slowly, the sound of a man weighing impossible choices. "How long? Few weeks, maybe a month, just until he's strong enough to travel. We keep him in the cellar. Nobody needs to know. He gets his strength back, delivers his intelligence to the Confederate command, and we've done our patriotic duty. Hell, Thomas, there might even be a reward in it. Recognition, maybe even accommodation from the governor. The cellar is not secure. The slaves go down there for supplies every day. Ruth sends that girl down there 3-4 times a day for preserves and cornmeal. Not the back section. Behind the preserve shelf, there's that old root cellar your father sealed up back in 52. Nobody's been in there for years. We open it up, put him inside, seal it back. I'll handle everything. Food, water, medical supplies. You just keep running the plantation like normal. Nobody will know." Another long silence. Bess could almost hear Thomas thinking, calculating risks, and Ben. If it's... Finally he spoke, his voice hard. If this goes wrong, Virgil, if anyone discovers we're harboring a fugitive, Confederate or not, the Union will burn this place to the ground and hang us both. And if the Confederacy finds out we kept this information from them for weeks while we nursed a spy back to health, they'll shoot us for treason. Won't happen. I'll handle everything. You have my word. Your word? Thomas laughed a bitter sound. Your word and a Confederate dollar will buy me nothing. But I don't see that we have a choice. If this man has information that could help the cause, we have a duty. God help us both. Bess heard their footsteps moving toward the cellar door, heard the creak of hinges that needed oiling, and then silence. She lay in her crawl space, her mind racing, processing what she'd heard. A wounded Confederate soldier hidden somewhere in the cellar beneath her feet. A man who would be killed if the Union found him. A spy with secrets that might prolong the war, might keep people like her in chains for years longer. A secret that Thomas Hargrove was willing to risk everything to protect. She should have stayed silent. Should have pretended she'd heard nothing. Should have gone back to sleep and continued her invisible existence, scrubbing floors and emptying chamber pots and waiting for the war to end one way or another. But Bess had learned long ago that information was the only currency enslaved people possessed, and knowing things that others didn't could mean the difference between survival and destruction. Knowledge was power, even for a child who had none. But there was something else, too, something she couldn't quite name, a curiosity about this wounded man, this spy who was being hidden like contraband. What kind of person was he? What had he seen? What secrets did he carry? And why did she feel a strange kinship with someone who was, by all logic, her enemy? The next morning she went about her duties as usual, emptying the chamber pots, scrubbing the front hall with a lye soap that made her hands crack and bleed, preparing breakfast under the sharp eye of Ruth. Ruth was a large woman in her 52nds, with gray hair and a face that revealed nothing. She ruled the kitchen with an iron spoon and a suspicious nature, watching everything, trusting no one. She'd been on the Harrow plantation for 30 years, had seen 3 generations of Harrows come and go, and she'd learned that survival meant keeping your head down and your mouth shut. You're moving slow this morning, Ruth observed, stirring a pot of grits. You sick? No, ma'am, just tired. Tired? Ruth snorted. You're 11 years old. You don't know what tired is. When I was your age, I was working the fields from sun up to sundown. You got it easy working in the house. Bess said nothing. There was no point in arguing. Ruth had her own hierarchy of suffering, and in it, field work was worse than housework, which meant Bess had no right to complain. Never mind that Bess worked 16 hours a day, that her hands were raw from lye soap, that she slept in a crawl space barely big enough for a dog. Ruth had suffered more. Therefore, Bess's suffering didn't count. Go down to the cellar and fetch me 2 jars of preserves. Ruth said the peach, not the blackberry. And don't take all day about it. Bess took a candle and made her way down the narrow stairs to the cellar. The space was low-ceiling and damp, smelling of earth and mildew and the sharp tang of vinegar from the pickle barrels. A single small window near the ceiling let in a weak shaft of morning light, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. The cellar was lined with rough wooden shelves holding jars of vegetables, smoked meat hanging from hooks, sacks of cornmeal and flour, barrels of salt pork. It was cool. Down here, a relief from the oppressive heat above. Bess moved slowly along the shelves, her eyes searching. At the back of the cellar, behind the preserves, as Virgil had said, she found what she was looking for. A section of the wall that didn't quite match the rest. The boards were newer, the nails less rusted, fitted together to seal off what had once been a doorway. Her father, or maybe her grandfather, she couldn't remember, had told her about the old root cellar built back when the house was first constructed. It had been sealed up after a slave had hidden there during a punishment, nearly dying before they found him. After that, Thomas's father had ordered it closed permanently. Bess pressed her ear against the wood and held her breath, listening. At first, nothing. Then, so faint she almost missed it. The sound of labored breathing. Someone was behind that wall, and they were suffering. She could hear the wet rattle in their lungs, the occasional moan of pain. The man was alive, but barely. Bess grabbed 2 jars of peach preserves and hurried back upstairs, her mind racing. She said nothing to Ruth, nothing to anyone. But that night, lying in her crawl space, she couldn't stop thinking about the man sealed behind that wall. She imagined him in total darkness, wounded and alone, dependent entirely on Virgil Cates for survival. And she wondered what would happen if Virgil decided the man was more trouble than he was worth. She'd seen Virgil kill before. A man who tried to run away, caught and beaten to death as an example. Virgil had no mercy in him, no compassion. If the wounded soldier became a liability, Virgil would let him die without a second thought. 3 days passed. Bess watched Virgil carefully, noting when he disappeared into the main house at odd hours, always carrying something. A canteen, a bundle wrapped in cloth, a small wooden box that might have contained medical supplies. He was feeding the hidden man, keeping him alive. But Virgil's face grew increasingly troubled, and Bess overheard him arguing with Thomas in the study one evening while she was supposed to be polishing the silver in the dining room. "He's getting worse," Virgil said, his voice tight with frustration. "Infection spreading, the wound's gone putrid. He needs a real doctor, someone who knows what they're doing. I've done what I can, but it's not enough. Absolutely not." Thomas's voice was firm. "We bring a doctor here. We might as well send up a signal flare for the Union. Every doctor in the county is being watched. They're looking for wounded Confederate soldiers. We bring one here, and within a day we'll have Union troops at our door. Then what do you want me to do? Let him die down there?" "If necessary." Thomas's voice was cold. "Matter of fact, we've done what we can. If he dies, he dies. We'll bury him in the woods, and no one will ever know he was here." Bess heard Virgil's sharp intake of breath. "He's got information that could save Confederate lives." "You're willing to let him die for convenience?" "I'm willing to protect my family and my property. That's all that matters. The Confederacy is losing this war, Virgil. You know it, I know it, everyone knows it, except Jefferson Davis. Sherman's marching through Georgia like a plague, burning everything in his path. The Union's going to win. And when they do, I want to be able to say I never harbored Confederate spies. I want to be able to prove my loyalty to the Union so they don't burn my house and confiscate my property. You're a coward. I'm a realist. And if you had any sense, you'd be one too." Bess heard footsteps, heard Virgil storm out of the study, slamming the door behind him. She quickly returned to polishing the silver, her hands shaking. The wounded soldier was going to die. Thomas H. had made his decision, and there was nothing anyone could do about it, except there was something Bess could do. That night she made a decision that would alter the course of everything that followed. She waited until the house was silent, until even Ruth, snoring from the kitchen corner, had settled into a steady rhythm. Then she slipped out of her crawl space, took a candle stub and a friction match from the kitchen drawer, and crept down to the cellar. Her bare feet made no sound on the wooden stairs. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Her hands shook as she lit the candle. The flame cast jumping shadows across the cellar walls, making the space seem alive, threatening. She moved to the back section, to the sealed doorway, and examined it closely. The boards had been nailed in place, but carelessly. There were gaps between them, and one board near the bottom was loose, probably from age and moisture. Bess sat down the candle and worked at the loose board with her fingers. It took several minutes, her fingernails breaking, splinters driving into her skin like needles, but finally the board came free with a soft creak that sounded impossibly loud in the silence. Behind it was darkness and the overwhelming smell of sickness. Sweat and blood and infection and human waste. The smell was so strong it made her gag. "Who's there?" The voice was weak, barely more than a whisper, but it carried a note of panic. "Virgil, is that you?" Bess pressed her face close to the opening, trying not to breathe too deeply. "I'm not Virgil. I'm not going to hurt you. I brought water." She'd taken a tin cup from the kitchen, filled it from the pump outside. The water was cool and clean, and now she carefully passed it through the gap. She heard movement, the sound of someone dragging themselves across a dirt floor with agonizing slowness, and then E-cup was taken from her hand with trembling fingers. The man drank desperately, water spilling down his chin. some of it splashing onto the dirt floor. When he finally lowered the cup, his breathing was ragged, labored. "Thank you," he managed. "Thank you. God bless you. You're the Confederate scout," Bess whispered. "I heard them talking about you." A pause. "Who are you?" "Nobody, just a girl who works in the house. They don't see me. I'm invisible." "You shouldn't be here. If they catch you," he broke off, coughing, a wet, painful sound that went on for nearly a minute. When he finally stopped, his breathing was even more labored than before. "They won't catch me. I'm careful." Bess hesitated, then asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "Are you going to die?" Another pause, longer this time. "Probably. The wound's infected. I can feel it spreading through my body like fire. Another few days, maybe a week." His voice was matter-of-fact, resigned. "I've made my peace with it. I've seen enough death to know what it looks like. I wish I could have gotten the information back to my commanders. Wish I could have made my death mean something." Bess thought about this. She thought about the casual cruelty she'd witnessed her entire life, the way people like Thomas Hargrove and Virgil Cates treated human beings as property, as tools to be used and discarded when they broke. She thought about her mother, sold away to a plantation in Alabama, probably dead by now from overwork or disease or childbirth. She thought about the Union soldiers she'd heard about, the ones who were supposedly coming to free people like her, though she'd learned not to trust promises from white men in uniforms, regardless of which side they fought for. Freedom was just a word, and words didn't mean much when you were 11 years old and owned by someone who could sell you or beat you or kill you on a whim. And she thought about the man behind this wall, dying slowly in the dark, because Thomas Harrow valued his own safety more than another person's life. It didn't matter that the man was a Confederate soldier, that his information might prolong the war, might keep her enslaved for longer. What mattered was that he was a human being suffering and alone, and she had the power to help him. "I know about medicine," she said quietly. "Not much, but some. Ruth taught me things, herbs and pusses, how to clean wounds, how to reduce fever. I could help you. I could try at least. Why would you do that?" The man's voice was confused, almost suspicious. "I'm a Confederate soldier. If the Union wins, people like you go free. You should want me to die. You should want the Confederacy to lose." Bess considered this. It was a fair question. "Maybe," she said slowly, "or maybe we just get different masters. I don't know what's going to happen. Nobody does. But I know what it's like to be trapped somewhere with nobody to help you. I know what it's like to be invisible, to have people walk past you like you don't exist. And I know I can't just let you die when I might be able to do something. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's how I feel." She heard him shift in the darkness, heard the rustle of fabric and the scrape of something against the dirt floor. "What's your name?" "Bess. I'm Daniel. Daniel Pritchard, 3rd Georgia Infantry Company B." He coughed again, but less violently this time. "If you're serious about helping me, Bess, you need to understand something. If they catch you coming down here, they'll punish you severely. Virgil Cates doesn't show mercy to anyone, especially not to slaves who disobey. And if they realize you know about me, they might kill you to keep the secret safe. Thomas Harrow is desperate, and desperate men do terrible things, I know. Then W. I risk it?" Bess thought about this question for a long moment. Finally, she said, "Because I'm tired of being invisible. Because I'm tired of watching people suffer and not doing anything about it. Because maybe if I save one person, it means something. Maybe it means I'm not just property. Maybe it means I'm a person who can make choices, who can do something that matters. I don't know. I just know I have to try." Daniel was quiet for so long that Bess thought he might have passed out. Then softly, "You're braver than most soldiers I've known. Braver than me, certainly." Bess replaced the loose board carefully, making sure it looked undisturbed. She took her candle and crept back upstairs, her heart pounding with fear and something else, something that felt almost like purpose. For the first time in her life, she was doing something that mattered, something that was her choice and hers alone. The next night, she returned, and the night after that, and the night after that. She brought water first, then food stolen in tiny amounts from the kitchen, pieces of cornbread wrapped in cloth, strips of dried meat, a boiled egg, a handful of pecans. Ruth noticed nothing. Bess had learned long ago how to take just enough to avoid detection. She knew which floorboards creaked, which shelves were checked most often, how to make herself invisible, even when she was standing right in front of someone. She brought clean rags torn from an old flour sack and a jar of salve that Ruth used for burns made from lard, and crushed plantain leaves that grew wild near the creek. Through the gap in the boards, working by candlelight, Bess cleaned Daniel's wound as best she could. The bullet had passed through his shoulder, entering from the front and exiting through the back, but both wounds were badly infected, the flesh around them hot and swollen and oozing pus. The smell was overwhelming. Bess forced herself not to gag. She'd seen infected wounds before. They were common on the plantation where medical care was non-existent for enslaved people. She knew what to do. She packed the wounds with the salve, changed the bandages, brought him willow bark tea to reduce the fever. She'd learned about willow bark from an old woman named Sarah who died 2 years ago, who'd known all the old remedies passed down from Africa and mixed with Cherokee medicine. Sarah had taught Bess which plants could heal and which could kill, which roots could ease pain and which could bring on sleep. It was dangerous knowledge. Enslaved people who knew too much about medicine were often suspected of poisoning, and more than one had been hanged for it. But Sarah had trusted Bess, had seen something in her that made her willing to pass on the knowledge. It was slow, dangerous work. Every night Bess risked discovery. Every night she expected to hear Thomas Hargrove's footsteps on the cellar stairs, to feel Virgil Cates's hand on her shoulder, to be dragged out and punished for her disobedience. But somehow, impossibly, she remained undetected. It was as if her years of being invisible had finally become an advantage, a shield that protected her from notice. Gradually, over the course of weeks, Daniel began to improve. The fever broke on the 5th night, leaving him weak and shaking, but lucid. The infection receded slowly, the wounds beginning to close and heal. His voice grew stronger. His breathing became easier. And in the darkness of the sealed root cellar, with only a gap in the boards between them, they talked. Daniel told her about his life before the war, a small farm in northern Georgia in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, 40 acres of rocky soil that barely produced enough to feed his family, but it was his, bought with money he'd saved working as a carpenter. A wife named Catherine, dark-haired and strong-willed, who'd grown up on a neighboring farm and married him when she was 16. A daughter named Emma, who would be 7 years old now, with her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes. He told her about the day he'd enlisted, believing he was fighting to protect his home, his way of life, his right to live free from northern interference. "I used to think it was about states' rights," he said one night, his voice quiet in the darkness, "about protecting our sovereignty from northern aggression. That's what they told us. That's what the politicians said, what the preachers said, what everyone said, and I believed it. I believed I was fighting for something noble, something worth dying for. But the longer this war goes on, the more I see what it's really about. It's about keeping people like you in chains. It's about rich men protecting their wealth while poor men like me die in the mud. And I don't know how to reconcile that with the man I thought I was." Bess listened, saying little. She'd learned that white people often needed to talk through their moral awakenings, needed to process their guilt aloud, needed someone to witness their realization that they'd been complicit in evil. It wasn't her job to absolve him, and she didn't try. But she appreciated his honesty, even if it came too late to change anything, even if it was born from suffering rather than principle. She told him about her own life, though there was less to tell. Her mother's face fading in her memory like an old photograph left in the sun. The endless work, the constant fear, the small rebellions that kept her sane, stealing a moment to watch the sunset, hiding a smooth river stone in her pocket like a talisman, teaching herself to read by studying the labels on preserved jars and the occasional newspaper left lying around the house. "You can read?" Daniel asked. Ed, surprised. "How?" "Taught myself. It's illegal, but nobody pays attention to what I do. That's the advantage of being invisible. I can stand right next to someone and they don't see me. So I watch and I listen and I learn. I know which letters make which sounds. I can read most words now, though the long ones are hard. That's remarkable. Most grown men I know can't read. It's not remarkable. It's survival. Knowledge is the only thing they can't take away from you. They can sell you, beat you, work you to death, but what's in your head is yours. That's what Sarah used to say. She was the one who taught me about medicine, about plants. She said knowledge was power, even for people who had no power.
She sounds wise. She was.
They sold her daughter south and she died 6 months later, just gave up, stopped eating, stopped talking, just faded away. I found her one morning in her cabin and she looked peaceful, like she'd finally escaped. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. I'm sorry, everyone, sorry. Sorry doesn't change anything. No, I suppose it doesn't. As May turned to June, Daniel's recovery continued. He could sit up now, could move around the small space of the root cellar. Bess had managed to bring him a blanket, a bucket for waste, a small tin plate and spoon. The space was still cramped and dark and miserable, but it was better than it had been. Daniel described it to her once, about 8 feet square with a dirt floor and stone walls that wept moisture. There was no light except what came through the gap in the boards when Bess visited. No sound except the occasional scurrying of rats. Nothing to do but sit in the darkness and think and wait. I'm going mad, he told her one night. I can feel it. The darkness, the silence, the not knowing what time it is or how long I've been here. Sometimes I think I'm already dead, that this is hell, that I'm being punished for my sins. You're not dead and you're not in hell. You're in Georgia, which is close, but not quite the same thing. He laughed at that, sound that turned into a cough. You have a dark sense of humor for a child. I'm not a child. I haven't been a child since I was 6 years old and watched my mother get sold away. Children get to be innocent. I never had that. No, I suppose you didn't. But a new problem emerged. Virgil Cates had stopped coming. Bess realized this after several nights of not hearing Virgil's footsteps in the cellar, not seeing him slip into the house at odd hours. She asked Daniel about it, and his response was grim. He came 3 days ago. Said the union's getting too close, that it's too dangerous to keep me here. Said he'd bring me food one more time, and then I was on my own. Said I should be strong enough to break out and make my own way north to the Confederate lines. Daniel's voice was flat, emotionless. He hasn't come back. I think Hargrove ordered him to let me starve. Easier than killing me outright. Less blood on their hands. Bess felt a cold fury settle in her chest, familiar and almost comforting. She'd felt it before when her mother was sold, when she'd watched Virgil beat a man unconscious for dropping a water bucket, when Thomas Harrove had sold a woman's baby to pay for a new carriage. The fury never went away, just simmered beneath the surface, waiting. Then I'll bring you more food. Enough to keep you going. Bess, you can't. You're already taking too much risk. If they catch you, they won't. You don't know that you're getting careless. You're coming down here every night. Someone's going to notice. Ruth's going to notice the missing food. Virgil's going to see you. And when they do, they'll kill you. Not punish you, kill you. Because you know too much. And dead people don't talk. I don't care. You should care. You're 11 years old. You have your who. The life ahead of you. The war is going to end soon, one way or another, and you'll be free. Don't throw that away for me. Free. Bess laughed bitterly. You think freedom is magic? You think the war ends and suddenly everything's different? I'll still be black in a world run by white people. I'll still be poor. I'll still have nothing. Freedom doesn't change that. It's better than slavery, maybe. Or maybe it's just a different kind of prison. I don't know. But I know I'm not going to let you die, not after everything. But she knew it was only a matter of time. Ruth was already giving her suspicious looks, noticing the missing food. The way Bess was always tired in the mornings, and Virgil had started watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl, as if he suspected something, but couldn't quite figure out what. She'd caught him staring at her twice, his small eyes narrowed, his jaw working like he was chewing on a problem. The situation reached a crisis point in late June. Bess was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, peeling potatoes, cutting up a chicken that Ruth had killed that morning, stirring a pot of beans that had been soaking since dawn. The heat was oppressive, the air thick and still, and sweat ran down her back and soaked through her thin dress. Ruth was at the table kneading dough for biscuits, her large hands working the dough with practiced efficiency. Through the thin walls, Bess could hear Thomas and Virgil arguing in the study. Their voices carried sharp and angry. "I want him gone," Thomas said, "tonight. I don't care if he's recovered or not. I don't care if he can walk or not. Take him into the woods and leave him there. If he dies, he dies. I won't have him on my property anymore." "He can barely walk," Virgil protested, his shoulders still weak. "You're signing his death warrant. Better his death than mine. The Union's within 20 miles of here." I heard it from Patterson yesterday. They're moving through the county, searching every plantation, every farm, every house. They're looking for Confederate soldiers, for supplies, for anything they can use. If they search this house and find him, we'll all hang. Me, you, everyone. I won't risk it. He's got information. I don't care about his information. The Confederacy is losing this war. Everyone knows it. Richmond's going to fall. Lee's going to surrender. And it's all going to be over. And when it is, I want to be able to look the Union soldiers in the eye and say, I never harbored Confederate fugitives. I want to be able to prove my loyalty. You're a coward. I'm a survivor. There's a difference. Now get him out of my house tonight. That's an order. Bess's hands froze over the pot she was stirring. She had to warn Daniel. Had to get him out before Virgil came for him. But how? Where could he go? He was still weak, still recovering. He couldn't travel far, couldn't move fast, and the woods were full of Union patrols. He'd be caught within a day. That night, she didn't wait for the house to settle into sleep. As soon as Ruth retired to her corner, snoring within minutes, Bess slipped down to the cellar, her heart racing. She pried loose the board and whispered urgently into the darkness, "Daniel, they're coming for you tonight. You have to leave now." She heard him move, heard the pain in his sharp intake of breath. "I can't. I'm not strong enough yet. I can walk, but not far, not fast. My shoulder's still weak. If I try to run, I'll collapse within a mile. Then I'll help you. Best, no. If they catch you helping me escape, I don't care. I'm not letting them kill you. Not after everything. Not after I've spent 2 months keeping you alive." She worked frantically at the other boards, pulling them loose one by one. Splinters drove into her palms. Her fingernails tore blue. Dee ran down her fingers, but she didn't stop. Finally, she'd created an opening large enough for Daniel to crawl through. He emerged slowly, painfully, and in the candlelight, Bess saw him clearly for the first time. He was younger than she'd imagined, maybe 25, with a gaunt face and hollow eyes and a beard that had grown wild during his confinement. His left arm hung useless at his side, the shoulder still bandaged with her makeshift dressings. He was thin, emaciated, his clothes hanging off his frame. He looked at her, and she saw something in his expression that might have been wonder. "You're just a child," he said softly. "I'm old enough to know right from wrong. Now come on, we don't have much time." She helped him up the cellar stairs, supporting his weight as best she could. He was heavy and she was small, and it was slow going. They made it to the kitchen, and Bess was reaching for the back door when she heard footsteps on the front porch. Virgil Cates coming to carry out Thomas's orders. Bess made a split-second decision. She shoved Daniel toward her crawl space beneath the stairs. "Get in there. Don't make a sound. Don't move. Don't breathe. Bess, now." Daniel squeezed into the narrow space, his face contorting with pain as he bent his injured shoulder. Bess pushed the small door shut just as Virgil entered the kitchen through the front hall. He stopped when he saw her, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "What are you doing up?" "Couldn't sleep. Came to get water." Bess kept her voice steady, though her heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. She moved to the water bucket by the sink, dipped a cup, drank slowly. Virgil studied her for a long moment, his small eyes moving over her face, her hands, her posture, looking for signs of deception. Finally, he grunted and moved past her toward the cellar door. Bess stood frozen, listening to his foot. Steps descending the stairs. She heard his curse of surprise when he discovered the loose boards. Heard him moving around the root cellar, searching, his boots scraping against the dirt floor. When he came back up, his face was dark with fury. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and grabbed her by the arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise, hard enough to make her gasp with pain. "Where is he? Where's who?" Virgil raised his hand to strike her, and Bess braced herself for the blow. She'd been hit before many times. She knew how to take it, how to protect her head, how to go limp so the bones didn't break. But before the blow could fall, a voice spoke from the doorway. "Let her go." Daniel stood there swaying slightly, his good hand gripping a kitchen knife he must have grabbed from the counter. He looked like he might collapse at any moment, his face pale and slick with sweat, but his eyes were hard. Virgil released Bess and turned to face Daniel. "You're in no condition to fight me, boy. Maybe not, but I can make enough noise to wake the whole house. And then Thomas Hargrove will have to explain to everyone why there's a Confederate deserter in his cellar. His wife, his neighbors, the Union patrols that are searching the area. Everyone will know I'm no deserter. That's what they'll call you. When I tell them you've been hiding here for 2 months instead of reporting back to your unit, that's what the military tribunal will call you before they hang you for cowardice and dereliction of duty." Daniel's voice was cold, harder than Bess had ever heard it. "Let us go and I'll disappear. You'll never see me again. Nobody has to know I was ever here. You can tell Harrove I escaped, that I broke out on my own. He'll believe you." Virgil's jaw worked, his hands clenching and unclenching. Bess could see him calculating, weighing his options, trying to figure out which choice cause him the least trouble. Finally, he stepped back. "You've got until dawn. After that, I'm reporting you to the Confederate authorities. They'll hunt you down like a dog, and when they catch you, they'll hang you. And you?" He looked at Bess, and there was something almost like pity in his eyes. "You're a fool, girl. You threw away your life for a man who'll be dead in a week. Was it worth it?" "Yes," Bess said quietly. "It was my choice to make. That makes it worth it." Virgil left without another word, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Bess and Daniel stood in the kitchen, the weight of what they'd just done settling over them like a shroud. "We need to go," Daniel said now before he changes his mind. "Where?" "North toward the Union lines. It's the only chance. If we can reach them, we'll be safe. You'll be free and I'll figure something out." Bess thought about this, thought about what she was leaving behind, the only home she'd ever known, brutal as it was, thought about Ruth, who taught her to cook and clean and survive, thought about the other enslaved people on the plantation, the one she was abandoning, thought about what lay ahead, uncertainty, danger, the possibility of death. But she also thought about the alternative. Staying here, returning to her crawl space, pretending the last 2 months had never happened, waiting for Virgil or Thomas to decide she knew too much and needed to be silenced permanently. "All right," she said, "let's go." They left through the back door, moving as quickly as Daniel's weakened state allowed. The night was thick with humidity, the air heavy with the scent of magnolia and honeysuckle and something else, something that smelled like rain coming. The moon was a thin crescent providing barely enough light to see by. They made it to the treen, and Bess heard a sound that made her blood run cold. Dogs barking. "They're
coming after us already," Daniel said.
His breathing labored. Virgil must have changed his mind, or Thomas didn't give him a choice, or he was lying from the start, giving us hope just to make the hunt more interesting. They pushed deeper into the woods, branches tearing at their clothes, roots threatening to trip them with every step. Daniel was breathing hard, his face pale in the moonlight, his left arm pressed against his chest. Bess knew he couldn't keep this pace for long. His body was still weak from the infection, from 2 months of confinement in the dark. He needed rest, needed food, needed time. But time was the one thing they didn't have. Behind them, the dogs grew louder, their barking frenzied now. Bess could hear men's voices shouting, could see the flicker of torches through the trees. They were being hunted like animals, and the hunters were getting closer. "Leave me," Daniel gasped, stumbling over a root. "You can move faster without me. You might make it—" "No, Bess," I said. "No. We started this together. We finish it together. That's how it works." They stumbled on, and Bess's mind raced, trying to think of something, anything that might save them. Then she remembered something Ruth had told her once about how to throw dogs off a scent. It was an old trick passed down from people who'd run away, who'd tried to escape and sometimes succeeded. It was a desperate gamble, but it was all she had. "There's a creek about 1/2 a mile east," she said, her breath coming in gasps. "If we can reach it, we can wade downstream. The water will hide our scent. The dogs won't be able to track us." They changed direction, angling toward where Bess remembered the creek running. She'd been there before, years ago, sent to fetch water when the well ran dry during a drought. The creek was sprinkled cold and clear, running over smooth stones. If they could reach it, they had a chance. The dogs were getting closer, their barking frenzied now. Bess could hear them crashing through the underbrush, could hear the men urging them on. She risked a glance back and saw torchlight flickering through the trees, maybe 100 yards behind them. They reached the creek just as the first dog burst through the underbrush behind them. Bess and Daniel plunged into the water, gasping at the cold shock of it. The water was waist deep on Bess, chest deep on Daniel, and the current was stronger than she'd remembered. They began wading downstream, fighting to keep their footing on the slippery stones, the cold water numbing their legs. The dog reached the creek bank and stopped, confused, casting back and forth for the scent. More dogs arrived and more men. Bess counted 4 torches, which meant at least 4 men, maybe more. She and Daniel pressed themselves against the far bank, hidden in the shadow of an overhanging willow tree, and held their breath. "Lost the trail," one of the men said, his voice carrying across the water. "Damn it, Virgil's going to have our heads spread out. Check both banks. They can't have gone far. That soldier's half dead, and the girl's just a child. We'll find them." The men moved along the creek bank, searching, their torches casting dancing shadows across the water. Bess and Daniel stayed perfectly still, the cold water lapping at their chins, their bodies pressed against the muddy bank. A mosquito landed on Bess's cheek and bit her, but she didn't move, didn't even blink. Daniel's breathing was shallow and rapid, and she could feel him shaking. From cold or fear or exhaustion, she couldn't tell, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. The search party moved on, heading in the wrong direction, following the creek upstream instead of down. The sounds of dogs and men gradually faded into the distance. Bess and Neil waited until the sounds faded completely, until they couldn't hear anything but the gurgle of the creek and the chirp of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. Then they climbed out of the creek on the far side, their clothes soaked and heavy, their bodies shaking with cold despite the warm night air. "We need to find shelter," Daniel said, his teeth chattering. "Somewhere to hide until I'm strong enough to travel properly, somewhere they won't think to look." Bess thought about this running through her mental map of the area. There's an old tobacco barn about 3 miles from here, been abandoned for years since before I was born. The family that owned it died in a fever, and nobody wanted the land because they said it was cursed. Nobody goes there anymore. Can you find it in the dark? I think so. I've been there once when I was little. My mother took me there to pick blackberries. I remember the way they walked through the night, moving slowly, stopping frequently to let Daniel rest. The woods were alive with sounds, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the call of night birds, the whisper of wind through the leaves. Bess led the way, navigating by memory and instinct, following landmark. Shehoff remembered a lightning-struck oak, a pile of stones that might have been a property marker, a clearing where wild roses grew. By the time the sky began to lighten in the east, painting the horizon with streaks of pink and gold, they'd reached the barn. It was a sagging structure with half its roof missing and walls covered in creeping vines. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and the windows were empty of glass. But it was shelter, and it was hidden, surrounded by overgrown fields and thick woods. They collapsed inside, too exhausted to speak. The barn smelled of rot and mildew and old tobacco, but it was dry and relatively safe. Bess found some old burlap sacks, a corner, and used them to make a rough bed. Daniel lay down with a groan, his face gray with pain and fatigue, his injured shoulder pressed against the makeshift pillow. "Thank you," he whispered, his eyes already closing. For everything, Bess sat beside him, her back against the wall, keeping watch. "Don't thank me yet. We're not safe. We're not even close to safe. No, but we're alive. That's more than I expected when I woke up this morning." They slept through the day, taking turns keeping watch through the broken windows. Bess woke every hour or so, her body conditioned to never sleep too deeply, always alert for danger. Each time she woke, she checked to make sure Daniel was still breathing, still alive. Each time she listened for sounds of pursuit, Dogs barking, men shouting, horses approaching. But the woods remained quiet, peaceful, as if the world had forgotten they existed. When night fell again, Bess ventured out to search for food. She found wild blackberries growing along the edge of a field, their branches heavy with fruit. She dug up some edible roots, wild onions, and a few small potatoes from what must have been a garden once. She filled a canteen from a stream, the water cold and clean. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them going for another day. This became their routine. They stayed in the abandoned barn for 3 weeks, hiding during the day, moving only at night. Bess foraged for food, stole vegetables from nearby farms when foraging wasn't enough, once even managed to snare a rabbit using a trap she'd learned to make from watching the men on the plantation. Daniel's strength slowly returned. The wound in his shoulder healed, though his left arm would never regain its full strength. The muscle had been damaged too badly, the nerves severed or scarred. They talked during the long hours of hiding. Daniel told Bess more about his life, about his WI, Fay Catherine, and his daughter Emma. He talked about his plans, how he intended to desert the Confederate Army, make his way north, start over somewhere far from Georgia. He talked about his guilt, about the things he'd done in the war, the men he'd killed, the orders he'd followed even when he knew they were wrong. "I shot a man once," he said one night, his voice barely above a whisper. "Union soldier. Couldn't have been more than 18 years old. He was wounded, lying in a ditch calling for his mother. I could have taken him prisoner, should have, but my commanding officer said we didn't have time, that we needed to move fast, so I shot him, put a bullet in his head, and I can still see his face, still hear him calling for his mother. I'll hear it for the rest of my life." Bess listened, saying nothing. What was there to say? The war had turned everyone into monsters, had forced people to do things they'd never imagined themselves capable of. Daniel wasn't unique in that he was just another man trying to survive in a world that had gone mad. She told him more about her own life, about the small rebellions that had kept her sane, about teaching herself to read, about the smooth river stone she kept in her pocket, about the way she'd learned to make herself invisible, about her mother and the day she was sold, and the way Bess had screamed and clung to her skirts until Virgil tore her away. "Do you think you'll ever see her again?" Daniel asked. "No, she's probably dead. Most people don't last long on the Alabama plantations. They work you until you drop, and then they replace you. That's how it works. I'm sorry. Everyone's sorry. Sorry doesn't bring her back." In early August, they finally felt strong enough to continue north. They traveled by night, following the North Star, avoiding roads and towns. They passed through forests and fields, crossed rivers, hid from Confederate. E-patrols and Union scouts alike, it was slow, dangerous work, but they were getting closer to the Union lines with each passing day. They survived on foraged food and stolen vegetables, on water from streams, and the occasional kindness of enslaved people who saw them passing through and left food where they could find it. A loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, a jar of preserves, a smoked ham. These anonymous gifts kept them alive, kept them moving forward. Then on a night in mid-August, everything changed. They were moving through a dense pine forest, the air thick with the scent of resin and needles, when they heard voices ahead, men speaking in low tones, the clink of metal on metal, the sound of a camp settling in for the night. Soldiers, but Bess couldn't tell which side. She and Daniel froze, listening. "Patrol's due back in an hour," one voice said. "If they're not here by then, we assume they've been captured or killed or deserted. These woods are crawling with Rebs and deserters from both sides. Can't trust anyone anymore. Captain says we're moving out at dawn, heading toward Mon. Should be there in 3 days if we don't run into trouble." Union soldiers, they'd finally reached the Federal lines. Daniel looked at Bess, and she saw the hope in his eyes mixed with fear and uncertainty. They'd made it. Against all odds, they'd actually made it. But what came next? What would the Union soldiers do with a Confederate deserter and an enslaved child? They stepped out of the trees, hands raised, moving slowly so as not to startle the sentries. The Union soldiers spun toward them, rifles raised, and for a moment Bess thought they might shoot first and ask questions later. But then an officer stepped forward, a young man with lieutenant's bars on his shoulders, studying them in the moonlight. "Who are you?" he demanded, his hand on his pistol. "Daniel Pritchard, 3rd Georgia Infant." Try. I'm deserting. And this is Bess. She saved my life. She's been traveling with me for 2 months, helping me reach your lines." The officer's eyes moved from Daniel to Bess, taking in her torn dress, her bare feet, the exhaustion etched into her young face. "How old are you, girl?" 11, sir?" Something shifted in the officer's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or respect, or pity. "You've been traveling with this man alone for 2 months?" "Yes, sir. I helped him escape from the plantation where I was enslaved. We've been hiding, moving at night, trying to reach the Union lines. He was wounded, and they were going to let him die, and I couldn't. I couldn't just let that happen." The officer was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Then he lowered his rifle and gestured to his men to do the same. "You're safe now, both of you. Come with us. We'll get you food, clean clothes, a place to sleep, and then we'll figure out what comes next." They were taken to a Union camp, a sprawling collection of tents and wagons and campfires spread across a clearing in the woods. Bess had never seen so many soldiers in one place. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all wearing the blue uniforms of the Union Army. They were given food, real food, not foraged roots and stolen vegetables, but salt pork and hardtack and coffee that was bitter but hot. They were given clean clothes, though the smallest uniform they could find for Bess still hung off her like a sack. They were given a tent to share with real blankets and a canvas floor that kept out the damp. Bess was questioned extensively about the Hargrove Eve plantation. Its location, its defenses, the number of enslaved people there, the layout of the buildings where Thomas Hargrove kept his valuables. She answered as best she could, though she felt a strange guilt about betraying the place that had been her prison. It was irrational, she knew. The Hargroves had never shown her any loyalty, had never treated her as anything more than property, but it was still the only home she'd ever known, and there was something unsettling about giving the Union soldiers the information they needed to destroy it. Daniel was questioned, too, about Confederate troop movements and strategies, and the intelligence he'd been carrying when he was wounded. He provided what information he could, though he made it clear he wanted no part in the war anymore. The Union officers seemed to accept this, though Bess noticed they kept him under guard as if they didn't quite trust him. 3 days later, a Union regiment moved on the Hargrove plantation. Bess wasn't there to see it, but she heard about it afterward from soldiers returning to camp. Thomas Hargrove had fled before they arrived, taking his wife and whatever valuables they could carry in a single wagon. They'd headed west toward Alabama, and nobody knew what had become of them. Virgil Cates had tried to fight, barricading himself in the main house with a rifle, and been shot by Union soldiers when he refused to surrender. He died on the front porch, bleeding out while the house burned behind him. The enslaved people had been freed, though Bess learned that freedom meant being herded into contraband camps, where conditions were often as bad as the plantations they'd left. The camps were overcrowded, disease-ridden, with inadequate food and shelter. People died there by the dozens, from typhoid, from dysentery, from simple starvation. Freedom, it turned out, was more complicated than anyone had imagined. Bess asked about Ruth, about the others she'd known, but nobody could tell her what had happened to them. They'd scattered, disappeared into the chaos of a collapsing South, trying to find family members who'd been sold away, trying to build new lives from nothing. Daniel left the camp in September, heading north toward Pennsylvania, where he hoped to find work and eventually send for his family. He said goodbye to Bess with tears in his eyes, pressing a small carved wooden bird into her hand, something he'd made during their weeks in the barn, whittling it from a piece of oak with a knife he'd borrowed from one of the Union soldiers. "You saved my life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll never forget that, never. You're the bravest person I've ever met, and I've met a lot of brave people. If I ever have another daughter, I'm going to name her Bess in your honor." "What will you do?" Bess asked, turning the wooden bird over in her hands. It was beautifully carved, with delicate wings and a tiny beak. Every feather rendered in miniature detail. "Try to be a better man than I was. Try to make something good out of all this suffering. Try to teach my daughter that